There's an epidemic sweeping the poker world. Tens of thousands of poker players are already showing symptoms. Hopefully, you're safe. But by the time you're watching this, statistically, at least one poker player you know will have been infected. If you hear a poker player in your life utter the phrase,
"That size isn't a thing,"
unfortunately, they're already far too gone. It doesn't matter if you tell them, "Listen, you big dummy, if you give a solver the sizes 5% pot and 500% pot, it'll build a strategy where those two sizes are, in fact, a thing." They still can't hear you. While it may be too late for them, hopefully you can still be saved. So today, I'm going to show you 5 spots in poker where unconventional sizes can win you the most amount of money. And if you ever hear anyone say,
"That size isn't a thing,"
run. All right, let's jump in. First example of where that size isn't a thing, the 8x check raise as the pre-flop raiser. So let me show you. We are going to open 9s from the cutoff. A rec is going to call on the button, and flop comes Jack, 9, deuce. I promise I won't use this board for every example in this video. I promise. And we are going to check our range. As you know, I'm a big fan of checking my range out of position to recreational players because they tend to overstab, telegraph their hand strength with their bet sizing, and they do not protect their check back range with strong hands. So I am going to check it over. He is going to stab for just about half pot, and we are going to put in the big boy check raise for $200, the 8x check raise. All right, so we used mass data analysis. We pulled millions of hands, filtered for fish, playing 25 NL and 50 NL online. Now, this isn't a perfect approximation for live, but it's going to be better than just guessing randomly, because fish who are playing low stakes online are going to have a lot of the same leaks as fish who are playing live, especially with their pre-flop ranges. So this is the range of what a fish calls on the button versus a cutoff open. As you can see, very, very wide here. And if you're wondering, hey, why are queens, kings, aces, ace, king suited, why are those hands not in there? Those hands are just getting 3-bet. As you can see here, this is our strategy after we check to them and they stab. We are just not using that 8x check raise size almost ever here on this board at equilibrium. Here is their strategy when we check raise 8x on this flop, and as you can see, they're folding quite a lot. Top pair overall for them is folding 70% of the time. So the king jack, queen jack, ace jack, overall, top pair is folding 70% of the time. They're also only continuing with their flush draws about 50% of the time at equilibrium. As you can see here, a lot of their smaller flush draws, like the 7-6 of spades, 6-5 of spades, 7-5 of spades, these hands are just folded at a very, very high frequency. So I just went in and locked 2 adjustments here. Number 1, the top pair only folds 50% of the time instead of 70% of the time. So they're calling 50-50 with top pair to an 8x check raise. Seems reasonable. And the flush draws are calling 75% of the time instead of 50% of the time. So we bumped up the flush draws calling a little bit more. We bumped up the top pair calling a little bit more. Again, didn't go too crazy here. Top pair is still folding 50% of the time to an 8x check raise. Flush draws are still folding 25% of the time to an 8x check raise. And after locking these 2 small adjustments, here is our new strategy. As you can see, the 8x check raise starts to become used quite a bit here on this flop. All right, so my takeaway here, I'd like to use these egregiously large check raise sizes against recreational players when we start hands with a super high SPR. If we are deep, if we are in single raise pots, even if we're in a 3-bet pot and we start off relatively deep, these big check raise sizes allow us to play for all of the money against players who are going to make calling mistakes. They have just never seen someone check raise to 8x, to 10x, to 12x. They're just going to call way too much with their top pair, with their flush draws, with their straight draws, etc. And they are going to put in more money. In general, fish are the most inelastic pre-flop, and then they are the second most inelastic on the flop. They start to fold quite a bit on turns and rivers. That's where they start to get a little bit more elastic. We should be piling in the money against fish when they are the most inelastic post-flop, and that is on the flop. All right, example number 2 of this size isn't a thing, the 1/3 pot size river bet in position as a bluff. Let me show you. All right, so we start this hand deep. We are playing 2-5, 300 big blinds effective. Villain opens in the cutoff. We 3-bet on the button. He's going to call. Queen 9-4 here, and when he checks it over, my MO, 3-bet pots in position, just choosing a size where they raise off their strong shit, call with their weak shit. Usually going to be smaller in 3-bet pots and single raise pots. So I'm going to go about 1/3 pot here, $50. They are going to call. Turn is now a 3. Look at that sweet baby there. We now have a gut shot to the nuts here, but more importantly, this is a spot where we are both both deep and our opponent is capped. And when we are deep and when our opponent is capped, we need less equity in our hand because we have more fold equity. Remember, our opponent is capped because they would generally raise off hands like pocket nines, pocket fours, queen nine suited on the flop because the board is wet and dynamic and we chose a small size. Also, we start this hand super, super deep, and the deeper we are, the more fold equity we have, especially when our opponent is capped. So we are going to continue on this turn when our opponent is capped. I like to use large sizes because our opponent is not going to put in more money for us with their strong hands. So we are just going to go big here on this turn. Our opponent is never folding an ace high flush draw, a combo draw, a queen, etc. here on this turn, but they're also never going to check raise and put in more money for us with those hands if we bet small. So we go big, our opponent calls, river is now a deuce, and they check it over. I think this is super interesting with 7 high because we have a couple options here. I'd say a good percentage of the population, maybe a majority of the population even, who is not going to want to hang on with a 1 pair hand here. And what is their range when they get to this river? Well, most of their range is going to be 1 pair hands. The best hand they have getting to this river at a high frequency is going to be a hand like ace queen. Now, can they occasionally have 5, 6 of spades or ace 5 of spades? Sure, that's 2 combos of the nuts they can have. Okay, but if most of the population here is going to start folding king queen and queen jack and queen 10 when we jam on this river, well, maybe just putting in all the money here with 7 high is going to be good. Let's say we're up against a guy we just don't think is folding ace queen. Hell, he may not even fold king queen, queen jack, queen 10, even to an overbet jam here on this river for all the money. Should we just give up with 7 high? No. Of course not. We shouldn't give up with 7 high. The option here on this river, if you are against a sticky opponent, is to use a very small bluff size with 7 high. So let's say this is our opponent's range getting to the river. He has just a ton of queen X. He's got the ace queen. He's got the king queen suited, maybe even a little king queen off and ace queen off. And then he's got the queen jack, queen 10 suited. And then he also has a bunch of flush draws, these ace high flush draws, some of these king high flush draws, and then some of these suited connector type flush draws. And then maybe we give him a sliver of jacks as well that stuck around for the big bet on the turn. So this is his range getting to the river. And remember, this guy is real sticky. So if we jam on this river, we just don't think we're getting a ton of folds from the queen X. Let's say if we jam on this river for 1130, that ace queen is calling something like 90% of the time. King queen is calling 75% of the time. Queen jack is calling maybe 50-50, and queen 10, maybe we get a few more folds. Maybe that calls 25% of the time. But in general, he's just not doing a lot of folding with top pair here. Now let's consider this other 1/3 pot size bet on the river. And let's say he just never folds any queen X. Obviously, ace queen, queen jack, queen 10 are never folding if we bet 250 on this river. He's got a combo or 2 of the nuts. Let's just say these always jam, the ace 5 of spades, 6-5 of spades, and he's got a sliver maybe of 4s that didn't raise off on the flop, and those jam the river as well. But let's say when we do choose a size, we just get the king high flush draws to fold pure. We get the ace high flush draws to fold maybe 90% of the time. Let's say he gets sticky 10% of the time and calls us with ace 10 of spades or something like that occasionally for a hero call on this river. Let's also say he calls with the ace 3 of spades, ace deuce of spades, and 5-4 and 6-4 of spades, maybe 20% of the time here with 3rd, 4th, and 5th pair on this board. And then the slivers of pocket jacks he gets here to this river with, those just are almost never folding. They're calling 90% of the time here. All right, so with all those assumptions being made, with 7-6 of diamonds here, you see the small bet is our highest EV option. We're winning $55 by just betting 1/3 pot on this river. You see we're losing a ton of money by going for the jam here because our opponent is just calling way too much with queen X. And just as a really simple demonstration here, what does this mean when we have a hand like pocket nines on this board? We are winning the most amount of money here by just jamming on this river when we have value because our opponent is just not folding ace queen, king queen, queen jack nearly enough on this river. So pocket nines just wants to jam and put in the money. People just don't understand logic when they say stuff like, well, you know, if I go all in here, I don't think he's folding ace queen. Okay. Well, you have a really easy decision then. If you don't think he's folding ace queen, you bet small with your bluffs and you bet huge with your value. And there's people who say, well, you know what? I think this guy will fold ace queen if I go all in. Okay, well then you also have an easy decision. You go all in with your bluffs and choose a smaller size that ace queen will call whenever you have value. It's really, really easy, guys. One of those two things has to be true always. And it is up to us as poker players to figure it out. All right, guys, real quick, if you're enjoying this video, if you're getting value out of it, if it helped your poker game in any way, shape, or form, just leave a comment that says hefty. I think that's good for the algorithm, right? All right. Thank you, guys. Have a gentle day. All right, let's move on to spot number 3 of this size isn't a thing. The 1/3 pot size bet on the river, this time with value. All right, so same kind of situation here. Cutoff's gonna open. We are going to 3-bet. He's going to call. Same flop, queen 9-4. You guys know how much discipline it took for me not to use jack 9 deuce, but you wanted some other flops, so I gave you some other flops. He's going to check. We see bet small. He calls. Turn is a 3, giving us a combo draw. He checks it over once again on this turn. I think our opponent is capped. They're not going to be putting in more money for us. So I'm going to choose a large size here on this turn. We go 250. He calls. And river is an ace. And now he's going to check it over. So this is going to be our opponent's range getting to the river. Some queen X, ace queen, king queen, queen jack, queen 10. Maybe some slivers of jacks just like before. And then some busted flush draws. The king jack, king 10 suited, 8-7 suited, 7-6 suited, etc. And on this river, we've got a little bit of a quandary here because it's going to be hard to get value now when an ace comes on the river from a hand like queen king or queen jack. So if we go too big on this river, we're just going to be value owning ourselves against hands like ace queen all the time, and king queen and queen jack are just going to fold. So let's say we determine if we go small on this river, if we go 1/3, that our opponent's going to call with king queen maybe 90% of the time. Still, all the draws bricked here on this river. They maybe get sticky. Maybe the queen jack calls 75%, the queen 10 calls 50-50. Again, not anything egregious here. We're choosing a $250 bet into nearly $750 on this river. We're choosing the size where our opponent is going to call with the queen X a good percentage of the time. And let's say they just always jam the ace queen in our face here when we choose a small size. And then the small slivers of pocket 4s that they did trap with, those are always going to jam as well. As you can see here with the ace 5 of spades, the small size $250 is going to be our highest EV option on this river. The big size, not so great, because when we go big, again, we just get all the hands that are worse than us to fold. And in equilibrium, when people say, well, that size isn't a thing, they are right. The reason the small size isn't used in equilibrium is because it just opens the action back up, and then our opponent can just start check raise jamming a bunch of bluffs in our face and put us in a quandary. But in live poker, this just doesn't happen. In a pot where you have 3-bet, bet the flop, and potted the turn, and then an ace comes on the river, people just do not check raise the river as a bluff, and we can use that against them. We can exploit that tendency against them and have a higher EV line than trying to play equilibrium here by using this small size to squeak out a ton of value, taking advantage of the mistakes that our opponents make. All right, spot number 4, where that size isn't a thing, and I've been using this one quite a bit, a 10% pot size c-bet on an ace high board in a 4-bet pot. The hijack opens here. The cutoff is going to 3-bet, and we look down at pocket aces on the button. What a spot for us. We are going to put in the cold 4-bet. Hijack gets out of the way, and the cutoff calls. Flop comes very, very dry and static. Not really the best board for us when we have aces, because now it's going to be tough to get value from hands like queens, kings, etc. So our opponent is going to check it over, and I've been using this 10 to 12% pot size c-bet on these ace high boards and 4-bet pots a lot, and it is working very, very well. So here is the range I gave our opponent for continuing to our 4-bet. It's going to be really, really heavily weighted to hands like 10s, jacks, queens, some ace queen suited, some ace king off, ace king suited hands like that. We think they sometimes maybe just 5-bet the aces, sometimes 5-bet the kings, sometimes 5-bet the ace king suited. It's going to be maybe some of these smaller pairs as well, and a sliver, just a sliver of some suited connectors and some suited broadways in here. And just for reference, our range for cold 4-betting a cutoff 3-bet going to look something like this. We are just going linear, linear, linear. All of our good hands in the upper left-hand corner of this hot air hand balloon chart. Okay, so as you see here in equilibrium, the solver's playing kind of a mixed strategy. It's just mostly preferring to check. It's not really using this 10% c-bet size all that often. It kind of prefers the quarter pot c-bet or the check on this board. But let's look at what our opponent does in equilibrium. When we bet $50 here on this board, they're supposed to be really, really aggressive. They're raising ace king north of 75% here. They're raising pocket 9s 100% of the time here. They're turning 9x into a bluff like 10-9 and 9-8 suited. They're raising these underpairs that they have at small frequencies like 8s and 7s, and these suited connectors like 8-7 suited and 7-6 suited are just raising off here as well. And they're also turning these hands like king queen, king jack suited into bluffs right now, blocking hands like ace king and ace queen. They're folding jacks and 10s right around 75% of the time overall. So I made a couple small adjustments here. I had them raise ace king only 25% of the time as opposed to 75%. I had them not turn these king queen and king jack suited hands into bluffs here. I had them raise nines maybe 75% of the time instead of 100% of the time. Maybe on this board that's so static and so dry, they trap with middle set in a 4-bet pot some of the time. Seems reasonable, right? These 8s and 7s and 8-7 suited, these are just not turning into bluffs. It doesn't happen. And then finally, the jacks and 10s facing a $50 c-bet in a $482 pot. Let's say these hands fold about 50% of the time on the flop instead of 75% of the time. Now, once we make just a few small tweaks here, the solver on this board is not using the check, not using the quarter pot. It is just using the 10% pot size c-bet on this board all of the time. And in real world terms here, the reason why I think this tiny c-bet on these ace high boards is so good for us is because when we have aces, when we have this board locked down, kind of forces our opponents to call at least once here when they have hands like kings, queens, jacks, 10s. So we get value from all of these hands that we have basically drawing dead. Also, when we're bluffing here, say we have a hand like king jack suited in this spot, it's pretty good for us to use a small size as well because it allows our opponent to continue with hands like pocket queens or pocket 10s on this flop, and then we can get those hands to fold quite a bit on the turn. When we have aces here, if they have the last ace in our hand, we are going to stack that hand anyway. Look, the SPR is already less than 2. Even with going with a small size on the flop and a small size on the turn, on this board, we're going to stack ace king almost no matter what. So don't worry about stacking ace king. Worry about getting another street of value against kings, queens, and jacks here. So the very small, near 10% c-bet on the ace high boards and 4-bet pots, very good. All right, finally, spot number 5, where this size isn't a thing, the 1.5x overbet c-bet on ace high boards. Let me show you. All right, so first, you guys know I am a big fan of just range betting on almost every single board. So let me show you an example. Jack 9 deuce, one more time. I just had to sneak in one more. Our opponent checks over, and I'm going to choose a size here where our opponent is going to raise off their strong shit and call with their weak shit. And usually about 1/2 pot gets that done. We go $20. It's going to incentivize our opponent to raise when they have pocket 9s, pocket deuces, Jack 9 suited, etc. So all of their strong hands are raising here. They're going to float one time with a lot of weaker hands. But if we look at the exact same spot here where the board is ace 9 deuce rainbow instead of Jack 9 deuce with a flush draw, if we bet small on this flop, our opponent might not raise off their strong shit because this board is so dry and so static they don't really have anything to worry about. If our opponent has a hand like pocket 9s here or ace 9 suited, they may just call even if we bet small. So the problem is if we go small on this flop, well, now we get to the turn, our opponent is still uncapped, so we can't use this big overbet size on the turn because our opponent still has hands like pocket 9s, pocket deuces, ace 9, ace deuce, etc. And if we choose the big size again on the turn, well, our opponent might slow play once more, and we're just going to run into brick walls on the river that are just snapping us off, so our bluffs will become a punt. Okay, so what if we make an adjustment here? What if we still c-bet small on the flop, but now because our opponent is uncapped, we choose a small size on the turn to incentivize our opponent to raise when they have hands like ace 9, pocket 9s, pocket deuces that didn't raise on the flop. So we go small on the turn to try to encourage that to happen. Our opponent just calls. Now the river is a deuce and our opponent checks it over. But the problem is people just have so much ace X here. And not only did they have ace X, but if you've ever played live poker, a lot of people just flat, pre-flop with hands like ace king and ace queen, particularly from the big blind. So even if we overbet on this river, we can sometimes get hands like ace 5 or ace 7 to fold on this river, but we're just going to run into hands like ace king or ace queen quite a lot here that are never folding on this river. And the problem is our opponents have all the ace king and the ace queen off, and they don't have all of the, for example, ace 7 off, right? They just have like ace 7 suited and ace 6 suited. So they have a lot more combos of ace king and ace queen and ace jack on this board that just may never fold because we haven't made the pot very big. Yeah, it's a 2x pot size bet, but they're not playing for all the money. And I don't think most live opponents are going to fold even for a 2x pot size bet when they get to this river with ace king or ace queen. So here's a solution we recommend at Hungry Horse Poker. On these ace high static boards, when we are the pre-flop raiser, we use either an overbet or check strategy. What hands do we want to overbet? Well, of course, we want to overbet our value if we have a hand like ace king, if we have a hand like pocket 9s, pocket deuces, ace 9, etc. We would want to overbet because when we overbet on this board, our opponent is never folding an ace to 1-bet. They're never folding a 9 to 1-bet. And even if we bet small on this board, we're not going to entice our opponents to call here with hands like 6-7 suited or pocket 4s on an ace 9 deuce rainbow board. So we go for the overbet and just maximize value against the ace-x and 9x. The bluffs here we want to be a little more careful. Remember, it can be quite profitable to run the big boy airball bluffs if two things are true. Number one, if your opponent is capped, and number two, if you are very deep. Well, the problem is here our opponent is uncapped, so we generally don't want to start these big boy airball bluffs on the flop. The hands that we may consider starting bluffs with here on this flop are the hands that make it more likely that our opponent is capped. So I like to use hands starting bluffs, hands that maybe have a deuce in them or a 9 in them, making it way less likely that our opponent has a hand like pocket 9s, pocket deuces, ace 9 suited, and most of our opponent's range is going to be ace x. So if you do have a hand like 9-7 suited or king deuce suited, not only is our opponent slightly more capped because of the blocking properties of our hand, but we also have a little bit more equity in our hand as well. We can hit trips, we can hit 2 pair, and when we are going to go for the overbet on the flop and then the big bet on the turn and the jam on the river, that's when we think we can start getting our opponents to fold hands like ace queen, ace jack, ace 10 when we make them play for all the money. You may be wondering, what do we do with hands like 7-6 on this flop that we don't want to overbet? Most of our range actually on this flop, I would just be checking back. Our opponents aren't going to raise off their strong shit and call it their weak shit. They're not going to give us more information about their range, usually no matter what size we choose on this flop. But when we check back, our opponents are going to tell us a ton about the strength of their hand on the turn. Once we check back the flop, a lot of the times our opponent, if they have a very strong hand like ace king, ace queen, 2 pair, or a set, they're just going to come out and choose a big size on the turn. If our opponent just has a weak ace or maybe a draw or something like that, a lot of the time live opponents just use a smaller size or a check. If our opponent stabs big on the turn, well, we now have a much more clear idea of their range here. And if our opponent stabs small or checks here, now we can start applying a lot more pressure with our bluffs, just knowing our opponent is a little bit more capped. And when our opponent is capped and when we are super deep, we have more fold equity, and the more fold equity we have, the less actual equity in our hand we need to start running these big boy bluffs. I like to think of equilibrium as a delicate balance. Think of a seesaw, and there's 2 equal weight squirrels sitting on each side of the seesaw. The seesaw is going to be even. Well, if you go over to this squirrel over here and start plucking hairs off his tail, all of a sudden the seesaw is going to go like this. Just remember that equilibrium is a balance, and if one side is always showing up with all the hairs plucked off its tail, well, we have so much room to just make more money. That was a horrible analogy. It was horrible. Regardless, the next time you hear somebody say,
That size isn't a thing,
don't feel bad taking their money, because they're going to give it to somebody, and it may as well be you. Thank you guys, and have a gentle